Now, if anatomically modern humans with the modern brain, with our capacities and abilities, have only existed for 50,000 years, that doesn't leave a lot of room for a lost civilization to come and go. But then we find 196,000 years ago from Ethiopia, and then more recently 300,000 years ago from Morocco. And suddenly the expanses of time that have not been investigated, in which a civilization could have risen and fallen, become much greater. And that's why it's important that stuff just keeps on getting older.
Very fascinating also that the oldest known ones are from Africa.
Yeah.
And obviously that's where Egypt is.
Yes, that's exactly where Egypt is, and you know, we must recognize Egypt as an African culture.
Yeah,
that is what the ancient Egyptians were. I believe their language belonged to the Hamitic language family, which is closely related to the Somali language, for example, in East Africa. African culture, incredibly sophisticated, incredibly advanced, doing stuff that we just don't know how to do today. Archaeologists will tell you they could build the Great Pyramid, but I defy them to do that. The Great Pyramid is literally impossible. It's something that doesn't make any sense. It certainly doesn't make sense as the tomb of a megalomaniac pharaoh, which is what we're told it was.
Well, it's also sort of the ultimate, if you wanted to leave behind evidence of your culture, something that if there was a cataclysm and people did have to sort of rethink the history of the world, that would be the best thing to leave.
Time capsule.
Because it's so insanely sophisticated that you're forced to sort of reckon with this idea that something might have existed before us.
Yeah, definitely. And it incorporates all kinds of interesting math. It incorporates pi, which again is supposed to have been discovered by the Greeks. It incorporates the dimensions of the Earth on a particular scale. There's a lot about the Great Pyramid which suggests that it was intended to transmit information to the future. And that's one of the reasons why it's so big and so enormous, and why we keep on finding new chambers and passageways inside the Great Pyramid. There's a thing called Scan Pyramids, which is now going on, which is using the latest tech, and they've identified a second Grand Gallery above the Grand Gallery. The Grand Gallery is one of the wonderful features of the Great Pyramid. It's 30 feet high, 120 feet long, rising up through the center of the pyramid. But now we know there's a second one above it that hasn't been explored yet, and that's a result of Scan Pyramids. There's corridors and passageways that we didn't know were there. So the Great Pyramid is gradually, bit by bit, revealing its secrets, and it's almost as though it was waiting for a time when human beings were ready to receive those secrets and had the ability to decode them.
How do they access the second Grand Gallery?
Scanning. It's all.
I mean, humans. How can humans get into it?
It could. That's a very good question. It's there. The question is, at what point was it made? Was it part? It should have been part of the original construction of the Great Pyramid. As they were building the Great Pyramid, they created one Grand Gallery and they created another.
Is it the same size?
It looks to be the same size, yeah. From the scanning, the scanning just shows a void, but I'm informed reliably that the recent investigation has identified that void as another Grand Gallery, which is inside the Great Pyramid. And the Grand Gallery is one of the wonders of the world.
So it could have artifacts in it?
It could have artifacts in it. Same goes for those shafts that cut through the walls of the so-called Queen's Chamber and King's Chamber. I resist these names that archaeologists have applied to the Great Pyramid. I resist the notion that it was the tomb of Khufu. I resist the notion that the subterranean chamber, which is 100 feet vertically beneath the base of the Great Pyramid, was intended to be Khufu's tomb chamber, but then they just changed their minds and abandoned it. And then they built the one that's now called the Queen's Chamber. That was intended to be for Khufu, but they abandoned that as well. Then they went up the Grand Gallery and they created the so-called King's Chamber. And because it has a sarcophagus in it, and for no other reason, that is said to have been the original burial place of Khufu. It's not enough evidence, in my view.
And the connections to Khufu are from hieroglyphs depicting his vision that if he uncovered the Sphinx, he would become the Pharaoh of Egypt. Isn't there something along those lines?
There is something along those lines, and it's Thutmose the fourth or the third, if I remember correctly. In other words, he's a later pharaoh from the time of the Old Kingdom, and he put between the paws of the Sphinx a stela, which is called the Dream Stela. And in it, he records a dream that he had, that at that time the Sphinx was buried up to its neck in sand. And the dream was that he should clear the Sphinx. The Sphinx requested him or ordered him to free it of sand and reveal it again in its true form. This was at least 1,200 years after the Sphinx is supposed to have been built 4,500 years ago. But as you know, Robert Schoch and I and many others are convinced the Sphinx is much, much older than that it goes back 12,000 plus years.
And this is based on geological evidence of heavy rainfall, which is another interesting thing about the climate and the environment of that area, that we think of it as being desert, but at one point in time it wasn't.
Well, this is one of the reasons why I'm so frustrated by archaeologists claiming that they can know there was no lost civilization when they've done so little work in the Sahara, when the Sahara was, in a number of occasions during the Ice Age, incredibly fertile. Very, very nurturing environment with huge river systems running through it and lakes. It's not disputed that that was the case. It was a kind of environment that would have nurtured human civilization. And we really can't write off the possibility of a lost civilization until we take a much closer, much more detailed look at the Sahara. Of course, that's expensive. And then Egypt itself is in the Sahara.
Didn't they find fossilized whale bones in the Sahara?
Yeah, that would go back a lot further. That would go back to millions of years, to a time when the oceans were different, perhaps even hundreds of millions of years.
So Sahara at one point in time was an ocean.
As many places were.
Wow.
Pretty much anywhere where you find limestone was once covered by ocean. The world has changed. The world is constantly changing. It's like one of those magic kids' toys where you pull a lever and it wipes out the diagram you just made. You know?
Yeah.
It just keeps on. The world keeps on recreating itself, and we human beings make our journey through this changing world, and we try to fix it and say this is how things were, this is how things will be, and it never cooperates with us on that.
It's just incredibly fascinating that the timeline, when you go beyond the traditional timeline and you get back into where you and Robert Schoch have speculated the age of the Sphinx, now you're talking about a completely different environment of lush rainforest and many, many, many resources.
Absolutely. We're talking about a completely different Sahara. And Schoch's
kind of
evidence is of 1,000 years of heavy rainfall. That's what the Sphinx bears witness to, that it was already there when the rains of the Younger Dryas, and the Younger Dryas affected the Sahara with heavy rainfall. Just as further north it changed the climate and made it much colder. In the Sahara it became much wetter. And it's that period of rains that are the most likely culprit for weathering the Sphinx in the way it is. But it could have stood there for thousands of years before that.
There's also very clear evidence that the face in the Sphinx is much younger, right?
No doubt about that. Excuse me. Frog in my throat.
There's a little cough button if you want to hit that.
Oh.
If you ever want to hit it.
Do I have a cough button?
Yeah, you got a little red button there.
Is that this red button
Yeah,
here?
if you feel it coming on, just
Okay.
press that little
Okay.
sucker.